launching these cruise missiles deep into Ukrainian territory adjacent to Poland. It's that shows a very cavalier attitude towards NATO Article 5 and NATO security. I think the timing is telling. The fact is that Russia is deeply frustrated after losing her son. In certain regards, was looking for kind of some sort of saving grace out of the U.S. midterm elections and the idea that the Republicans would be more favorably disposed to put pressure on Ukraine to end this war, and of course the fact that Russia is looking for some incremental steps to apply pressure on the West to see support for Ukraine and to coerce Ukraine into negotiation. I think there's a lot to suggest that there's some. This may have been intentional. We'll see soon enough. Regardless, this warrants a significant response. There has been a loss of life in NATO territory at their hands of the Russians and their barbaric war. And if NATO were to show no reaction or limited reaction, it probably would entice additional Russian aggression. So something measured, something appropriate. These NATO Article 4 consultations that the polls are now calling for that have been announced are a good step, and some additional defensive positions, maybe some additional sanctions, maybe even some military action is likely forthcoming.
So, what sort of reaction do you think there should be? You said that if the NATO doesn't react or its reaction is too limited, that could be seen as some kind of green light to Russia. I mean, what do you think NATO's response should be?
You know, it's interesting. Listening to the Ukrainians immediately come out and again re-energize the call for a no-fly zone, additional air defense systems to protect both Ukraine skies, but frankly even NATO skies. Some of that doesn't seem as far-fetched. Certainly, the provision of additional military aid seems quite reasonable. You could see some desire by NATO to expand the envelope to defend the skies to include Western Ukraine. So, for instance, Russian cruise missiles that fly over Western Ukraine could be intercepted by NATO systems. That is not overly provocative. I think that's a quite a rational and reasonable step to make in this kind of situation, and that would provide some breathing room and some safe skies over Western Ukraine. I think that's probably the minimum response in this case. Otherwise, again, Russia is emboldened to think that could take an incremental approach to destabilizing security in NATO. And already we're in a scenario where the longer this war goes, the more dangerous it gets for the U.S. and NATO, and UK, of course, included. So some additional support to Ukraine is the minimum required.
But if NATO missiles were to intercept Russian missiles over Western Ukraine, that would clearly be seen as a provocation by Russia, wouldn't it? I mean, that wouldn't that in itself risk escalating the entire conflict?
Uh, Absolutely not. I'm actually having a hard time imagining how it could potentially be perceived as escalatory. This is clearly a response to Russia's strikes on or near or over the border into NATO. Russia is conducting an illegal war condemned by the vast majority of the world. Russia is acting in violation of the UN Charter, and the U.S. can absolutely reasonably take measures to protect the skies adjacent to NATO if not taking a kind of even a bolder step. So it is not escalatory. You have to remember that the context here is Russia is having a terribly hard time with this war, and to take steps against NATO based on what is amounts to a defensive action would be enormously disastrously bad for Russia to provoke a confrontation with NATO. This is not what pushes us towards a confrontation. This would be more of a deterrent step than anything else.
We know that Poland's president has been speaking tonight to President Biden. What do you think the US response will be? I should say that at the moment it's unclear whether indeed these were Russian missiles. And indeed, there do seem to be some suggestions that you talked about intentionality, but that perhaps this was just a mistake, a blunder.
It's possible it's a blunder. I think the fact is we still need to remember the context is that Russia is launching uh, these cruise missiles deep into Ukrainian territory adjacent to Poland. It's that shows a very cavalier attitude towards NATO Article 5 and NATO security. I think that would be a terrible precedent to let something like this go by without some sort of firm response. Again, not something we're not talking about going to war between NATO and Russia, but a sufficiently powerful response to deter additional types of provocations or even being cavalier with NATO security by firing missiles this close. These are supposed to be Russia's most expensive cable systems. Now, Russia is notoriously bad about these things. They Some of them don't launch, some of them don't hit their target. But the textbook answer for these cruise missiles are 5 meter radius for a point of impact. That's the precision that they're supposed to operate on. This was obviously well off the mark, and we need to treat it seriously. Otherwise, dismissing it would invite further kind of Russian adventurism.
We've had some condemnation from the meeting of G20 leaders, but because of the of many of the players that are there at the G20, even though Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has now left. It appears that any kind of statement out of that is going to be pretty weak. But there are now suggestions that NATO is going to hold what's called an Article 4 discussion
Yeah.
tomorrow. That would be presumably to ensure that there are further investigations into exactly what has happened.
Yeah, it won't take very long for NATO to determine exactly the kind of whether this was intentional or accidental. There is constantly intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance flying over this part of the world. They know exactly where these missiles were oriented towards. They would have a very good sense of whether this was a signal to warn off NATO or if this was an accident. And I think that this is not just going to be a simple consultation to do an exhaustive kind of investigation. This would be probably relatively quickly. This would be a decision to take some sort of actions. And I think that's going to be something that we'll see occur over the course of the next couple of days. This won't be a drawn out process.